أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجهم وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائم على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a second loud salawat. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجهم. For the hastening in the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajam. I hope everyone is doing well, inshallah. We will begin tonight, inshallah, with a new series of lectures for those of the Thursday nights that I will be addressing the brothers and sisters. We will be delving into this famous khutbah of Amir al-Mu'mineen known as Khutbah al-Muttaqin. This is khutbah 193 of Nahj al-Balagha. Couple points about Nahj al-Balagha so we even understand what Nahj al-Balagha is, where it came from, how it came to be. Within the Shia school of thought, we take Nahj al-Balagha, we speak very highly of Nahj al-Balagha, usually within the Shia school of thought. But if you were to go to the average Shia and ask them about Nahj al-Balagha, like what is it, who was the author, and what is the validity that it carries with it, you'll find that usually the average Shia will not have much information in this regard. They'll speak highly of Nahj al-Balagha. They say, we have to read Nahj al-Balagha. It's very important to read Nahj al-Balagha. But if you ask them what this Nahj al-Balagha is all about, they won't really know what it's all about. So I'll mention a couple of points with regards to Nahj al-Balagha in general, and then we'll delve into the khutbah itself. First things first is that when we say this khutbah is khutbah 193, for example, 109 and 2, 200 and this, different translations of Nahj al-Balagha have different numbering of the khutbahs, they have different numbering of the letters, and they have different numbering of the sayings. If you say Nahj al-Balagha saying number 7, that means based on one translation, it's saying number 7. Based on another translation, it'll be saying number 10, for example. So they have these differences, so that's something to remember. I said khutbah 193, in some of the Nahj al-Balaghas, no, you'll find it's like 184, 182, 180. Depending on the translation, you'll find different numbering in these khutbahs or the letters of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Okay, so what was Nahj al-Balagha? How did it come to be? Nahj al-Balagha is compiled by a scholar by the name of Sayyid al-Radhi. Sayyid al-Radhi and Sayyid al-Murtada were two famous scholars within the Shia school of thought who lived in the late 3rd century. This is the Hijri centuries, right? This 3rd, 4th, 5th century were very, very critical in the development of the Shia school of thought. Historically, that is where you had great scholars who put together books of hadith early on. Some of these books of hadith that we hear about, these are books that we have been compiled later on in history. Bihar al-Anwar, for example, was not compiled until the 10th century after Hijrah. What does that mean? That means almost 1,000 years after the Imams, or 900 years after the Imams, now the book is being compiled. Some of these scholars who were in the 3rd and 4th century, no, they were very close to the time of the Prophet and the Imams. Maybe 100 years, 150 years, yes, some of them a lot less than that. Closer to the time of the Imams. If you look at the time of the Prophet and the Imams all together as 250 years roughly, if someone is living in the end of the 3rd century, that means maybe he's off by 100 years. The gap between him and the Ma'asum is what? 100 years, 150 years, 200 years you'll see, for example. And that's why these books are so important, because the closer you are to that time of the real source, the more accurate your information can potentially be. So Sayyid al-Radhi, Sayyid al-Murtada, two brothers who were both scholars, were very high-ranking scholars. They were students of another great scholar whose name was Sheikh al-Mufid. He was the one who compiled Nahj al-Balagha, yes? And he compiled Nahj al-Balagha, and he explains in the introduction to his book as to why he even took the time to put together Nahj al-Balagha. But the important point about Nahj al-Balagha is, as we refer to it, we call it the peak of eloquence. Balagha meaning eloquence. Nahj, some say the path, some say the pinnacle. Regardless, it's all about eloquence. Nahjul Balagha is not a full compilation of all of the words and sayings of our first Imam. This is a very common mistake that people make. No, it's just some of the sayings and the letters and the khutbahs of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Yes, many of them you will find in Nahjul Balagha. Some of them will not be in Nahjul Balagha, because Sayyid al-Radhi, when he was putting together the book, his point about putting together the book was putting together those lines and sayings of Ali ibn Abi Talib that are very eloquent. They have a lot of balagha in them. You look at it from a literary perspective and you're mesmerized by it. And some of the lines of Ali ibn Abi Talib in Nahjul Balagha are like that exactly. From a literal perspective or a literary perspective, it's really unbelievable, the eloquence that you find in it. But that was the purpose of putting this book together in his own words. Therefore, first of all, it's not all of the sayings of Ali ibn Abi Talib. This is very important, because if you don't find something from Ali ibn Abi Talib in Nahjul Balagha, you can't then say that Ali ibn Abi Talib never had a stance on, for example, this issue. Maybe he's taken a stance somewhere else. That's number one. Number two is that especially the sayings, the hikam, at the end of the book, the part where we refer to as the hikmas or the hikam of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and even some of the parts of the khutbahs, some of them are taken out of context, not in a negative way, but because Sayyid al-Radhi was only looking at which part? At the eloquent part. He was trying to find the parts that are very mesmerizing from a literary perspective. Therefore, he may have not narrated the whole khutbah for you. He may have narrated maybe 5 lines of the khutbah. That's why some of these khutbahs, they're very, very short. Some of the khutbahs maybe like 3 lines, for example. Yes? So this is very important. Why? Because when we look at Nahjul Balagha, for the Shia school of thought, we look at it from a theological perspective. We're trying to understand what was Ali ibn Abi Talib's take on different issues. What was his stance on different issues? Whereas Sayyid al-Radhi is putting it together for what? For the eloquence of it and the beauty of it. So we have to remember this. He himself says, I was writing a book on the characteristics of the Ahlul Bayt. He has written this in the introduction to the book. He says, I was writing a book on the characteristics of the Ahlul Bayt, Khasa'isul A'imma. And he says, as I wrote this book, I came to the end. I wanted to make a little chapter at the end that kind of had the beautiful sayings of the Ahlul Bayt in it. Yes? He says, I made a little chapter in this book called Khasa'isul A'imma, and then I was done with it. Others who got that book of mine, they took a look at that last portion of the book. They said, these are so beautiful. Why don't you write a full book or compile a full book on those ahadith and sayings of Ali ibn Abi Talib in particular that are very beautiful from a literary perspective? And because I saw that demand was there, therefore I made the intention to make this, instead of one chapter of one book, to make it a full book. And that's how Nahjul Balagha came into existence. Okay. This book, of course, in the Shia school of thought, has a lot of weight. In the Sunni school of thought as well, it has quite a bit of weight as well. From a historical perspective, it plays a very key role. Because when you go back 1400 years ago, it's not like you can just sit there and get a full print of everything that Ali ibn Abi Talib was saying. Yes, this is history. History, you have to go back and put pieces of the puzzle back together. So if you have something like Nahjul Balagha that's telling you at times what Ali ibn Abi Talib was saying, it becomes very important. It becomes important for you. It becomes very important for other schools of thought as well, because they also care about what Ali ibn Abi Talib has said. They have a different interpretation of who he was and how he went about things. Nonetheless, he's a very important character for them, yes? Therefore, you find Shi'i scholars have written sharh, explanation of Nahjul Balagha. Sunni scholars have also written sharh, an explanation of Nahjul Balagha. Amongst the most famous of them is the sharh of Ibn Abil Hadid al-Mu'tazili. You'll hear his name quite often at times. Sheikh Muhammad Abda is another one. These are famous Sunni scholars. He in particular is Egyptian, that have written sharh or shuruh on Nahjul Balagha. So it carries a lot of weight in terms of what Ali ibn Abi Talib is saying in this book. I'll come to the final point before we actually get into the khutbah itself. And this last point I'm going to make is very, very important. Yes? If you consider yourself a lover of Ali ibn Abi Talib and one who attributes himself to Ali ibn Abi Talib, like we all do, this is very important. That is, this book of Nahjul Balagha has come to us, whereas the ahadith that are mentioned in it, the narrations that are mentioned in it, there is no chain of narrators for them. So when you look at the hadith, Sayyid al-Radi has not told you, for example, I'm narrating this from Fulan, who narrated this from Fulan, who narrated this from Fulan, all the way back to who? Back to the Imam, for example, or at least one of the Imams at the very. That's not how Nahj al-Balagha is. When you look at the beginning all the way to the end, it just starts out, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ali ibn Abi Talib said this. Whereas you look at some of our other books, no, they come with chains of narrators. You know how a lot of times we might ask this question of, how do I know if this hadith is really true? One of the factors is that you have a chain of narrators that you can trace back this hadith all the way to who? All the way to a ma'soom. If it's the actual imam that said it, great. It might be a grandchild of his who's narrating on behalf of him. Like for example, a lot of times, Imam as-Sadiq will narrate on behalf of the Prophet, and he won't even say where he got this from when he's speaking on behalf of the Prophet. Imam as-Sadiq never saw the Prophet. Yes? But he speaks of his own knowledge. So as long as you can trace it back to at least one ma'soom, you're good to go. Yes? But Nahj al-Balagha, you don't find this. So what does this mean? And what are we supposed to do with this book then? When you look at Al-Kafi, no. Every hadith tells you, I heard this from this person, who heard it from this person, who heard it from this person. You have a chain of narrators to work with. Let's see how reliable these individuals are. But Nahj al-Balagha, you don't have that, yes? Nahj al-Balagha isn't our only book of hadith that is like this. There are also other books of hadith that are also like this as well. All of this to say that you and I have to be cautious. You can't take everything in Nahj al-Balagha as something that what? Ali ibn Abi Talib definitely said. No. There are things in there, like any other book of hadith, that scholars will look at and they will say, you know what? There's a very good chance the Ma'soom, Ali ibn Abi Talib, said this. There are things in there they might look at it and they say, you know what? We can't be sure he said this hadith, for example. It's very important to remember. Because it doesn't come with chains of narrators, other scholars have tried to look at these ahadith in other books and in other sources to see if they can find a chain of narrators for this hadith somewhere in some other book. Maybe some other scholar has mentioned a chain of narrators, or a sanad as they say, for this hadith to substantiate it, yes? To say, okay, here's how you can trace back this hadith to who? To the Ma'soom. That's a technical discussion. I don't want to go into that. The point I'm trying to make is this. Just because something is in Nahj al-Balagha, therefore you believe in it wholeheartedly, 110%, that's not true. Could very much be what Ali ibn Abi Talib said. At times, it may not be as well. And the strongest book of hadith that we have within the Shia school of thought, Al-Kafi, is also, this applies to it. So let alone a book like Nahj al-Balagha that doesn't have any chain of narrators, okay? It's very important to remember, within the Shia culture, we have come to a point where if we say something is hadith, that means it's reliable. That means you can act based on it. When Muharram comes around, when Safar comes around, when Ramadan comes around, when Rajab, Sha'ban, these months come around, how many times do you find, messages being forwarded and passed along? Yes, if you recite this one line, then this will happen to you in the grave, and then you don't have to worry about anything. You'll be good to go on the Day of Judgment. Why? Because this hadith says is just the beginning of the discussion. Then you have to substantiate it, then you have to figure out where it came from. Just because hadith says a lot of things. Scholars, they give this analogy. They say hadith is like an ocean. I don't know how many here have been to fishing before, yes? If you're fishing, for example, in a lake, in an ocean, there's a lot of fish in there, but it doesn't mean you always catch a fish. Sometimes you're fishing, what do you catch? You get like some shoe that was lying at the bottom of this ocean, right? There's pearls down there. There's also some things that are not very valuable. In this literature of hadith, some things are pearls because the Imam said them. Some things, no, people attributed them to them. Say, hey, this is what he says. So just because it's hadith, therefore we have to act upon it, therefore we have to do it? No. How do we substantiate these ahadith? I'm not going to go into that. That's a technical discussion. As it relates to this khutbah in particular, one of the ways that scholars will look at a hadith or a khutbah and they say, you know what? Even though we don't have a chain of narrators for this hadith, but we will take it as if Ali ibn Abi Talib has said it in fact, is when the content of this khutbah is content that you can automatically understand from other verses of the Quran and other hadith anyways. So hadith comes and says it's good for you to pray. If you substantiate this or you don't substantiate it or not, doesn't matter, because you already know what? Praying is good for you. Yes? Therefore, those khutbahs of Nahjul Balagha that don't have content that becomes very, very, disputable, those, because the content we already understand from other verses of the Quran and Hadith, even if we don't have a chain of narrators for it, you can believe in it. It's not a problem, because even if you didn't have this hadith, there's other ahadith and other verses of the Quran that say the same exact thing. If they say it's good for you to pray and it's good for you to be low maintenance, which is one of the characteristics that Ali ibn Abi Talib is going to talk about the Muttaqin, you don't need, chain of narrators for this. Why? Because you already know this is something that is good. Yes, Ali ibn Abi Talib is just putting it into a particular wording for you. Yes, he's adding this literary touch to it that makes it beautiful, or analogies, for example, to it to make it more beautiful. Otherwise, the content is already accepted from your perspective. So that's very important to remember. Okay, moving on to the khutbah itself. Nahjul Balagha, of course, has roughly 240 khutbahs or sermons, 60 letters roughly. Out of this 240, there's one that's called Khutbatul Muttaqin, the sermon of the pious servants of Allah, the sermon of those who are muttaqi. What does taqwa mean? Long discussion, but I'll give you just a brief understanding of it. Taqwa comes from the root word of wiqaya. Wiqaya means when you protect yourself, when you prevent something bad happening. Taqwa means I fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enough that I don't disobey Him. I don't allow this disobedience to come into my life. This is the meaning of taqwa. You can have longer discussions on it. For our purposes, this is more than enough for us to understand. The pious and obedient servants of Allah. This is what this khutbah is about. Okay, delving into the khutbah itself now. Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. روي أن صاحبا لأمير المؤمنين يقال له همام كان رجلا عابدا. Says one day, this friend, companion of Amir al-Mu'mineen, whose name was Hammam. Hammam with a ha, not with a ha. Yes? It has a different meaning to it. Hammam, companion of the first Imam. Kana rajulan abidan. And he was one of those companions of the Imam who was amongst those who used to do a lot of acts of worship. When the hadith says he was abid, do ibadah, of course, all the companions of the Imam used to do ibadah. So when he says he was abidan, that means in particular he was the type who used to pray a lot, who used to fast a lot. He was zahid, he would live a very simple and modest life. Yes? Kana rajulan abidan. Okay. He comes to Amir al-Mu'mineen. فَقَالَ لَهُ يَا أَمِيرَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. He came to the first Imam. He said, صِفْ لِي الْمُتَّقِينَ. This is the request I have of you. Describe for me the muttaqin. Explain to me what these muttaqin are like. كَأَنِّي أَنظُرُ إِلَيْهِمْ. Describe to me in such a way as if I'm seeing them in front of me. Like I want you to describe them in detail for me. And for some reason, Ali ibn Abi Talib was hesitant to do this. And the hadith continues and shares with us why he was hesitant to do it. So the Imam responded to him. The hadith says, فَتَثَاقَلَ عَنْ جَوَابِهِ. He kind of became hesitant to respond back to him. Didn't want to go into much detail with Hammam because he felt like Hammam would not have the capacity to hear the detailed description of the muttaqin and for him to be able to take it. This is a concept that's not very familiar to us. But when the Imam went through this hadith with him, Hammam passed away. In the sense that this description was so detailed, it was so beautiful for him, that it was difficult for him to even take it. This is a concept that's not very familiar for us. I mean, if I hear a description, I'm not going to faint. I'm not going to faint, let alone pass away, yes? But for Hammam, because he had that faith, when Ali ibn Abi Talib described to him line after line after line, over 100 different characteristics that he mentions in the hadith, he was blown away essentially. And of course, at the end, the Imam mentions to someone else who was there that no, this was actually the time for him to go anyways. He would have gone. But nonetheless, Ali ibn Abi Talib he's hesitant. He says, he turned to his companion, Hammam, ittaqillah wa ahsin. He said, listen, forget about this detailed description. Just fear Allah, try to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa ahsin, and be kind, do good. فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ مُحْسِنُونَ. Because Allah is with those who are obedient and they do good. Just stick to the general stuff that we already have. But Hammam, he really wanted to hear. فَلَمْ يَقْنَعْ Hammam. He really wanted to hear this description because he knew the literary skills of Ali ibn Abi Talib. He wanted to hear this. When you come across, an artist, if the artist says, yeah, I worked on this work, he says, no, show me that masterpiece that you have, فَلَمْ يَقْنَعْ Hammam. Hammam was not okay with this. He said, no, I really want to hear. You tell me what these guys are really like. حَتَّى عَزَمَ عَلَيْهِ. So then Amir al-Mu'mineen, he said, okay, fine. If you won't let me go, I'll describe them to you. Here it goes. فَحَمِدَ اللَّهَ وَأَثْنَى عَلَيْهِ. He praised Allah and he recited salawat upon the Prophet. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum. ثُمَّ قَالَ. And then he said, أَمَّا بَعْدَ. As it relates to describing the Muttaqin, I'm going to start the discussion from here. This is what Ali ibn Abi Talib is saying. He said, أَمَّا بَعْدَ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى خَلَقَ الْخَلْقَ حِينَ خَلَقَهُمْ غَنِيًّا عَنْ طَاعَتِهِمْ. He said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala started his creation, but let's start from the beginning of creation. He said when he created his creation and these creatures you find around you, he didn't create them because he needed them. He created them while he had no need towards them. غَنِيًّا عَنْ طَاعَتِهِمْ. He didn't need them to obey him. Number one. Number two, آمِنًا مِنْ مَعْصِيَتِهِمْ. And he was immune from their disobedience. If they were to disobey him, it wasn't going to hurt him anyways. Okay. This is just the first line of the khutbah, yes? This is, again, a concept we are not familiar with as human beings. Because everything that you and I do as human beings, we do it because we lack something and we want to get something out of it. Right? Like for example, I pick up a book of Nahj al-Balagha, I read it. Why? Because I'm ignorant towards Nahj al-Balagha. I want to gain knowledge, right? There's something I'm trying to get out of this book. Yes? I'm hungry, I go and eat to satiate my hunger. I'm thirsty, I drink so that I can do what? I can quench my thirst. There's always something I do because I lack something. I'm trying to get something out of it, yes? But here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created these billions of creatures, more than you can count. If I were to ask you how many insects exist, none of us will be able to get the right number. Insects, He's created all of this, and Ali ibn Abi Talib is saying, listen, he didn't need any of it. This is kind of mind-blowing for us because we're not used to this. No, when we do things because we need something out of it. You don't go to work and then someone asks you, say, why did you go to work today? It's just for the fun of it. No, you went there because you were trying to make money, you have a career, whatnot. Yes, you have something you're trying to get out of it. That's number one. Number two, you are never immune to those things that you use. The food that you eat might make you sick. Yes, the water that you drink might be polluted. But with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He says, created everything. And He says He doesn't need their ibadah and their obedience. And at the same time, He is completely immune from their disobedience as well. Even if a father and a mother bring a child into this world, are they 100% immune from the evil of that child? No. Even though they technically brought this child into this world, they're not. This is very unusual for us. So then the question that of course comes to mind is, then why did He create all of this? I mean, why put yourself through all of this? Forgive me, but I use this wording. Why put yourself through all this trouble? If you're doing so well, and you're saying you don't need it, you don't need their ibadah, and you're immune from their disobedience as well, I mean, why bother? You and I bother because we need something. But I mean, He doesn't need it. So why bother? Usually when this question comes up in our communities, or in our Sunday schools, we go to what? We go to this famous verse of the Quran, which is verse 56 of Surah Al-Dhariyat. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. We did not create you except that you would worship us. Yes? Many of us have heard this verse of the Quran before. And this is a very incomplete understanding of the purpose of our creation. Very incomplete. Because the hadith is saying He didn't need you. But on the other hand, you're telling your child, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created all of us just so that you would worship Him. But He's saying He doesn't need it. So then the question is still there. What, He wasn't wise? He doesn't need the worship, but He still created you just to worship Him? Doesn't make sense. There's something that's supposed to be coming out of this worship. Otherwise, if He just created you and I to worship Him, He Himself is saying, I didn't need your worship. So there's something else that's supposed to come out of this. It's a very, very big mistake we make. That this is the way we introduce religion to our kids. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you so that you would worship Him. Okay, so then what? No, that's it. Just created you to worship Him. And Ali ibn Abi Talib is from the beginning. He says He created you and He didn't need your worship. So then what is His worship doing then? I mean, we just prayed. Why am I bothering myself praying? Yes? If He doesn't even need it. On the other hand, He says, no, I created you just for this. Because He doesn't need it, you're getting something out of it. But what are you getting out of it? It's this concept, this abstract concept that we call perfection. But this is an abstract concept. Let's talk practical. What that means is that when you do worship of Him, every act of worship develops a certain characteristic within your character. Every act of worship, it develops a certain characteristic within you. Salat, one of the biggest things it does is your humility. Makes you humble. Because you have to come, you have to stand here, you have to bow down to Him, you have to do this, you have to do, all based on all these detailed rulings that we have in Islam, yes? You have to do wudu before it, your clothing has to be tahir, it has to be this time. 5 minutes later, it's qada. So, I have to, He's really, like, you have to go by the rules, yes? Salat works on your humility, for example, amongst other things it works on, yes? Then you'll find other acts of worship, they work on other things. Like you have to pay khums or zakat, for example. It works on your generosity, the charity that you pay. And so on and so forth. Some things, they work on your patience, for example. The more the human being develops every single characteristic, the more he comes closer to what we call perfection. Perfection just means that you are a human being, that all of these different characteristics of His have grown. Then where do you see the manifestation of this? You see the manifestation of this in the next world. You don't even see it in this world. In this world, you see it a little bit. I might be the most patient person on earth. I might be the least patient person on earth. When you look at me right now, can you tell? No, looks the same. When you come to the next world, they remove these barriers, material barriers. Now they see who you are. They see who your soul is. Those things that you have created in your soul become the pleasures in heaven. This heaven that we talk about, it's not something that's separate from you. No, it's that same patience that you developed. It's that same generosity that you developed. It's that same, for example, humility that you developed. When we say, come closer to perfection, you become perfect through ibadah and worship. What does that mean? That's just a fancy way of saying you become a better person and you see these characteristics in the next world. That's what heaven is. Heaven are these characteristics that we have built in this world. So to sum it up, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you for heaven. That's it. But in order to get there, you have to come into this world where there's difficulty, you'll be tested, you have to obey Him, you grow yourself. Therefore, the next world, your heaven is created by you. Yes? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't take us and put us into heaven. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings us here, so you create your own heaven through the characteristics that you build for yourself. Yes? Based on this, He has brought you here, but He does not need your worship. And He is immune from your disobedience. Okay, moving on to the next line, and inshallah, we'll be wrapping up. He says, فَقَسَمَ بَيْنَهُمْ مَعَايِشَهُمْ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything, then He started to divide amongst people their sustenance. A concept that hadith says, Quran says, that listen, your sustenance, even though it doesn't look like it, it's already divided, it's already decided. This flies in the face of everything that the society today tells us. Because society today tells us you have to do this and you have to do that. Should you work hard? Absolutely. Should you plan? Absolutely. But the reality is everything has been divided and decided already. So the idea that I have to have this type of career and I have to have this type of money. You should work towards it. But if he doesn't want it to happen, it's not going to happen. فَقَسَمَ بَيْنَهُمْ مَعَايِشَهُمْ وَوَضَعَهُمْ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا مَوَاضِعَهُم. And he put everyone in their own place. Every person has their own place. You and I, we try to get out of our own place. We try to live the lives of others. You look at the guy beside you, you're like, oh, I wish I was living his life. Yes? And that's what social media is, right? You look at another person and say, oh, that their life, I wish I was in their shoes. And Ali ibn Abi Talib is saying, no, فَوَضَعَهُمْ مَوَاضِعَهُمْ. He put everyone in the place that they're supposed to be. For somebody, he put them in a very affluent country. For some people, he put them in a country that's not doing so well. For some, he gave them a whole host of talents. Some people, no, he didn't give them that many talents. It's a real thing. Some people are very talented. Some people are less talented. Yes? It just depends. He has chosen this life for you. And the important thing is for you to be okay with that life that he has chosen for you. فَقَسَمَ بَيْنَهُمْ مَعَايِشَهُمْ وَوَضَعَهُمْ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا وَمَوَاضِعَهُمْ. And he says, now based on this, amongst people you will find different groups. فَالْمُتَّقُونَ فِيهَا. Those who are pious. Hum ahlul fada'il. The pious ones are the virtuous ones. The ones who have virtues. What does this mean? This means that this is the type of person, when you get to know him, you are attracted to his character. This is one of the main characteristics of someone that we call muttaqi. You know, we say people are God-fearing. What's the result of being God-fearing? If the result is not him being virtuous, if the result is not him having a character that you are drawn to, this person is not God-fearing. A muttaqi, he's the type of person that the more you get to know him, the more you want to be around him. He may not put himself out there very often. Yes? Sometimes he's well known, sometimes he's not well known. That's not part and parcel of who he is. Sometimes people know about him, sometimes people don't know about him, this muttaqi character we're talking about. But those who do know him, those who are close to him, they want to spend time with him. They want to be with him. And I'll end with this line, because this is a very good litmus test to see if I'm even close to this group or not. Yes? When people get to know me, do they want to come closer to me? Or no, is it the situation that when people get to know me, the more they get to know me, the more they get to find out about me, the less interested they are in me all of a sudden. When spouses get married, initially the situation is what? This is wonderful, it's great. And that's important, it should be like that initially, yes? Then when they get to know each other, then God forbid, if it's like this, that the more they get, because it's not always like this, sometimes it's like this. The more they get to know each other, all of a sudden, I didn't think it was going to be like this. God forbid. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes no, they get to know each other, yes? They've built so much trust with one another, they've compromised for one another so much. Say, I wish I knew you before we even got married. I wish we were even closer. So al-Muttaqun are such a people. They're not famous per se, but those who are close to them and are around them, they want to be around them and they want to spend more time with them. Yes, people are attracted to their character. And the question is, are people attracted to your character and my character? If the answer is not really, then I'm also not a muttaqi either. Because taqwa comes with all of these different virtues. Inshallah, there we'll end. The next lines of the khutbah are very beautiful, but we'll leave that inshallah for the following session, where he starts to actually get into some of the details about how they speak. Next week, inshallah, will be about the manners of speech and what you're supposed to pay attention to when you speak to, especially your loved ones. We'll talk about that next week, inshallah.